Our old coverage of the NZXT H700i included a lengthy section on what we deemed to be a bug-filled fusion of hardware and software that would be a waste of money even if it worked properly, with that device finding its way into the trash can during the review. That was the Smart Device, version 1, which was reclaimed from the trash can for exactly this content piece. The intended function of this black box was to automatically modulate fan speeds to find an optimal balance between noise and thermal performance, relying on internal microphones to gauge the noise to thermal response. In practice, its function is to raise the MSRP of the H700 and H710i models by an average of $30. We didn't actually get any performance numbers for the original Smart Device because we could never successfully coach it through the software calibration phase, something NZXT claims to have fixed in the 2 years since. Today, we're testing to see if the Smart Device is still a net negative for the intelligence of the H-series cases. Before that, this video is brought to you by Corsair's Hydro X water cooling series. Corsair's strength is bringing water cooling to the masses, and it has built out cooling solutions with industry leaders to help newcomers get into open-loop cooling. Corsair has fittings, adapters, GPU water blocks, CPU water blocks, pump res combos, and radiators all available in the Hydro X line. As you can see in our footage, these kits can be used to build beautiful open-loop systems. Learn more at the link in the description below. It's been a couple of years now since reviewing the H700i, NZXT's high-end case at the time, and our main thing we asked for in the case review was an H700D for dumb, something our Patreon members contributed to the naming of. The H700D did happen. They didn't name it H700 dumb, much to our dismay, but they did launch an NZXT H700 with no letter at the end, and that was a cheaper option that had all of the very high quality build features of the H700 chassis, but without the worst part of it, which was the Smart Device, and also allowed the price to come down a bit. So the H700, with its launch pricing of roughly about $150, was extremely competitive. It's not an airflow-focused case, but it can brute force its way to good enough territory with cooling performance, while also having a lot of really quality and unique features for the time when it came out that have been since improved with the H710. So to be clear, we've liked the H700 series, H700, H710, as cases, as physical hardware. It was the Smart Device that we really had issues with, and the software primarily revolving around that with CAM. So we had no issues recommending the non-I versions, but now the question is if the I series is now at a point where we could recommend it without having that hesitation because of the Smart Device, or the so-called Smart Device anyway. So we're going to do that today. We're testing everything. We have a bunch of benchmarks, talk about how it works, what these things are theoretically supposed to do versus what they actually do, and also if there's any differences between version 1 and version 2. And while we're doing that, we must go through CAM, which has been pretty universally criticized online for a lot of things, like being generally slow and buggy, but also for telemetry. And NZXT's been trying to fix that with the new version, but we're going to have to look at both the new and the old today. So let's get started with that, and then we'll talk conclusions. As we alluded to in our NZXT H510 Elite review and the H710 review, the Smart Device version 2 has arrived, and we've finally gotten around to testing it. The PCB inside the new Smart Device is visibly different, but the aim of this review is to see whether different is also better. Also, to actually review the Smart Device, since the software was too broken last time to even test it. The first hiccup in this process was, once again, CAM. The version of CAM available from NZXT's website is now a 1.6 megabyte executable that connects to the internet and searches for the most recent version of CAM to then download and install. That would be okay, extremely annoying, but okay most of the time. But we have two problems with this. One, it's not possible to download an older version, which is required if you want to use the advertised seminal feature of the original I-series cases, ANR, or adaptive noise reduction. And two, we keep our testing bench completely offline. So we had to clone the drive and then briefly connect to the internet with the new drive in order to get CAM even installed. The fresh, revamped version that was installed was happy to run in guest mode, and much less obnoxious about trying to force us to register an account than the original, extremely sluggish CAM that we were used to. This is a good improvement by NZXT and is much appreciated. Reducing the forceful nature of creating an account is always a good thing for software that's installed locally on your computer anyway. With CAM up and running, our setup was done. There's no more calibration phase, thankfully, because last time it got stuck processing until we got Task Manager involved. And instead, it's now just a profile selector with a readout of temperatures, RPM, and case noise internal level. That's because ANR isn't yet included in the revamped cam at all, although it will be added down the line, according to NZXT. Given that ANR was such a massive selling point for the I-series cases, we're disappointed to see that it wasn't prioritized. But we also suspect it wasn't particularly functional because it really wasn't when we first tried to use it. Profile options here are silent, performance, and fixed. And under each profile, each channel's fan curve can be adjusted. There are 3 channels and set to depend on either the CPU or the GPU temperatures. Although there's a readout of case noise, digging into the fan profiles doesn't imply that noise levels affect the fan speed. They're normal fan curves that adjust the fan to X% speed at Y temperature threshold. So we said goodbye to the new and improved cam and found a download for version 3.7.8 on a questionable website, because NZXT only hosts the newest version, so official support for ANR is currently 0. And we did validate that the version we downloaded is properly CAM 378. We also noticed a bug with CAM where exiting the software after setting a pump and/or fan speed would reset both to the silent option, which is 1, unexpected, and 2, dangerous, because if the user is setting a manual fan speed and pump speed, for example 100%, they probably want it to stay there, but that's a different issue altogether. 3.7.8 is a great reminder of why we got so annoyed with the smart device to begin with, and why NZXT has scrapped and rebuilt its software from the ground up. The app starts itself on boot, but it takes forever to load, and it then immediately starts doing stress tests in the background. Sometimes on boot, it wouldn't load the stored information, and it had to be closed and reopened before ANR would even work. That's if you're logged in, since ANR doesn't work at all without connecting to the internet. We don't think that this is sinister, although it could be interpreted as such, especially with all the data trafficking back and forth. We just think that it's simply stupid. A custom fan curve is a tiny amount of data that's literally useful in only one location, and that's the system it came off of in the location the system is in. It doesn't help to have that stored server-side. It doesn't help us, certainly, and it doesn't help NZXT. There's no use that noise data could offer without knowing what fans, what case, or what environment the smart device is running in. NZXT had big dreams to make this some sort of deep learning AI application and use the data it's receiving to apply smarter profiles. But as you'll see from the profiles we got, it's clearly not working. It needs to go back to school or something. Hopefully the new software will handle ANR better. But it's a moot point because the new software doesn't have adaptive noise reduction, at least not yet. It's 3.7.8 or nothing for anyone that's spent the extra money on an I-suffixed NZXT case in the past 2 years. So it feels fair to dunk on this old software version. Here's a quote from NZXT. The new Smart Device V2 includes a faster microprocessor for cam-powered control of 2 Hue 2 RGB lighting channels and 3 fan channels that support either voltage-regulated or PWM fans. That's what NZXT has to say about the differences with version 2 of their smart device. Version 1 only has 1 lighting channel, so chalk it up to 1 concrete improvement. There are 3 fan channels on both devices. The H510 Elite that we use for testing comes with 2 140 front fans with 4-pin PWM connectors and 1 120 rear voltage-regulated 3-pin fan. ANR controlled all 3 fans effectively. Well, poor choice of words. It was capable of attempting to control the fans, but setting static fan speeds for the voltage-regulated fan worked sporadically at best on both devices. Testing the smart device with CAM presented its own problems. First and foremost, there's no way to see the fan speeds. The fan RPM is not reported anywhere when using ANR, or again, adaptive noise reduction. It's not reported in hardware info, which we like a lot. It's not reported in ADA. It's not even reported through CAM itself, the software NZXT makes for this purpose. So the custom fan curve defined by ANR is also not visible, along with the RPM. And we decided to run a torture test, log the temperatures we saw while spot checking the RPM of the 3 different primary case fans that we were testing, each with a different controller channel, just to isolate them from each other. This was done at idle and under a sustained load for a long period of time. GPU and CPU RPM were each locked to make the ANR as meaningful as possible because we really care about the fan speeds on the case here. Otherwise, they'd ramp independently and affect the calibration of the case fans. So that's obviously a consideration. Calibration was done in a quiet room. We did this with AC disabled. We did this with no other noise in the room, so door closed, no one's in there. And this is in our normal noise testing room, same place. It's just we had to run these tests for the entirety of the calibration, which is upwards of 30 minutes. So it takes quite a while. And since we're allowing the case fans to run on a curve, we thought carefully about whether or not we want to use things like delta T over ambient as opposed to just the straight temperature reading. And for case tests, we set static fan speeds for every fan in the case to control the environment. And therefore, we need to help cancel out the fluctuations in ambient, plus or minus 1 degree. Delta T over ambient helps with this. But in this test, the fans are actively responding to and controlling the CPU and GPU temperature sensor readings if you're using the smart devices as we're trying to today. And if the room ambient goes up, the fan curve should be partly accounting for that increase in temperature already. So that's an important thing to look for. In the end, we settled on using deltas anyway because, spoilers, the ANR fan curves we got barely affected fan speed. This isn't a perfect solution, and this is why we never use any fan curves during case testing. At best, the curve will level temperatures out and make every temperature and case look all the same, and at worst, it throws a big wrench in all the testing. So deltas are much easier to compare with this, and that's what we ended up using. Here's a screenshot of the Smart Device V2. Ignore all the numbers in this screenshot. Since we were using the H510 Elite as our test platform, we started with the Smart Device V2 that comes pre-installed. The screenshot shows the claimed advantage over, quote, preset, although which preset isn't specified. And there's no context for whether these numbers are averages or spot checks. Here's a table to help. With ANR applied, the top front fan ran between 910 and 920 RPM, the bottom front fan between 910 and 950 RPM, and the rear fan between 920 and 930 RPM. Under load, these increased to 930 RPM, 950 to 960, and 980 respectively. We measured these numbers with an external tachometer, since CAM won't report fan RPM with ANR enabled, and we trust these numbers more than the ones on the CAM score sheet. The CPU was at 86 degrees Celsius, and the GPU at 1080 Ti was at 73 degrees Celsius when these speeds were logged. These are high temperatures that might realistically be seen under heavy loads with air coolers, and fan speeds should definitely be ramping to compensate. CAM knows that too, because it was popping up CPU temperature warnings nonstop, which has a certain irony when it's the same software that's limiting the fans to half their maximum speed. Note that the GPU is not the same as our case review, so the data can't be compared to those. So the fact that CAM is warning us about these higher temperatures, but also is responsible for those higher temperatures, it's kind of like a stop hitting yourself scenario. We're not quite sure what it's trying to achieve. We also wanted to take noise readings, but experimenting with static fan speeds bugged out and broke the ANR profile completely. We can check the Smart Device V1 section, which is coming up next, for some noise readings. The differences are minute, but we'll save temperature comparisons for the end of this piece. Here's another screenshot. CAM's own measurements show that the Smart Device V1 came up with slightly different optimal fan speeds. Again, we can't see the fan curve, just some arbitrary RPM numbers without context. The GPU fan reading was also bugged for this test. We did have it set to a fixed speed of 55%, and it was spinning, but it's reporting at 0% for some reason. We don't know what the CPU load or GPU load numbers are supposed to mean or why they're related to fan speed. Spinning fans faster doesn't reduce the CPU load, it just makes it cooler. NZXT has also taken a very glass half full approach here by coloring good numbers green, but leaving bad numbers black instead of making them something more alarming. So there's no user feedback between either it's good or it's somewhere between average and bad. It'd be nice to have some UX improvement in this regard. Here are the actual fan RPM numbers as measured with a tachometer externally. They're almost identical to the speeds we logged with the Smart Device V2, down to the load speeds being barely more than the idle speeds, even without using a fan curve. Fans can easily fluctuate within a 50 RPM range. There's no perceptible increase in audio with an increase in load, obviously, because there's barely an increase in fan speed. 36 dBA is pleasantly quiet and is the threshold we use for noise normalized testing, so at least we can say that NZXT lowered the noise levels, but not because the device is intelligent. it just chose low noise, low RPMs. The front fans are capable of hitting 1600 RPM, and we measured this case with similar internal components, hitting 45-ish originally at 20 inches, but that did have a lot of turbulence issues, to be fair, with this specific case. The biggest problem here is that there's no difference between idle and load. They're basically the same. They're within 50 RPM or so, which is very nearly variance. So the thing that's supposed to be smart and set a fan curve that adjusts based on load is failing to do even the most basic version of that. This is the same as putting a resistor in line of your fan cable and just letting it run. It is. Or you could go into BIOS and just lower the speed to 40% or whatever it may be, because there's no curve here. ANR isn't setting a fan curve, it's setting a fan line. And that's really all it's doing. It's just a line segment. That's all it's making here. Now we're getting to some temperature comparisons. For the GPU, we can see that there's really not any difference at all in the deltas. In both tests, the 1080 Ti we used for testing had throttled down in frequency by the end. So this really is about as close as it gets when considering GPU boost parameters. There's no meaningful difference. CPU power load varies throughout the course of our testing because of the nature of this particular Prime 95 deployment, but it appears that the V1's curve is close to the same or maybe slightly inferior for CPU cooling as the peak deltas exceed the V2's. It might just be variance here, but more likely we're looking at the slightly higher speed for the V2 set for the rear exhaust right behind the CPU cooler as having an impact. The question we were trying to answer with all of this was, is the Smart Device version 2 better than the Smart Device version 1? And the answer is, well, V2 has an extra LED plug. Beyond that, the idea of better is sort of tricky in the first place to answer, because all the smart devices do is control the LEDs and the fan speeds based on a software profile. So frankly, nearly everything the smart device says it does or wants to do or hopes to do is also doable by BIOS or by software utilities. In terms of what it's executing today, that's true. The smart device has dreams of doing more, but it hasn't proven that it can execute on those. So right now, it's not any different than any other fan control software or BIOS that you could use in terms of its ability to execute changes on fan speed. So no clumsy software or additional hardware is required to do what this thing says it's supposed to do today. The Smart Device V1 has a microphone and a fan and LED hub. The Smart Device V2 has a microphone and a fan and LED hub. These are the only physical elements on the whole thing that matter, and everything else is just software. It's all cam. That's all this thing is a hub to use cam. So NZXT could alternatively sell a $5 microphone and then build software around that, tape the mic inside the case yourself, and use the software to adjust the fan speed based on the noise levels in the case. It would accomplish much the same thing, but without any of the additional hardware that you get with the smart devices. It's unclear why the smart device needs to be smart at all. It's a small, miniature computer that needs to be connected to the motherboard of an infinitely more powerful large computer that probably also has more fan channels, and that's connected between the smart device and the motherboard via USB to function. The larger computer can already do nearly everything CAM can do, and if software is the only limitation, that can also be solved with different software that's lighter weight. The only advantage would be that CAM can be shut down and the device will still adjust the fan speeds independently of the software, in theory. In practice, selecting ANR and closing CAM left the fan speeds mostly static, regardless of the CPU or the GPU temperature, but they were nearly static with CAM open too. So we can't say for sure whether the smart device works on its own. It's not really clear. We tried setting the performance fan curve and that stopped working as soon as CAM was closed, but the ANR fan profile is a different beast. And as we mentioned earlier, NZXT devices have a tendency to reset themselves if CAM is closed while they're still connected via USB. Within CAM, ANR describes itself as, quote, a smart fan profile that optimizes noise level while keeping temperature constant. All it did for us, though, was basically set the fans to about 900 RPM. It's kind of where it started and stopped. So, oh, and it also shows some pleasantly green numbers to make you feel like you've done something good. But NZXT's current stopgap approach of just treating the smart device like a cheap hue plus and grid combo, while they work on re-adding ANR back to the new version of CAM, is a lot more grounded, and it's easier to understand than the original intent. But without the noise reduction features, the smart device, it sort of just becomes pointless, even more pointless than before, because that was a big selling point. And as we mentioned before, NZXT doesn't host any version of CAM that works with ANR. You have to get it somewhere else, or find it maybe buried on their forum somewhere. But Softpedia is probably your best bet for ANR, and then you just grab the most recent version of old CAM, which isn't officially supported. And further, NZXT has steered clear of mentioning ANR as a feature of the smart device on the product pages for their new cases. The H510 Elite also includes the NZXT Smart Device V2. It says, powering the built-in RGB strips and case fans. No mention of ANR. There's one exception in that the features page, which is separate from the product page, technically lists ANR as a feature. But this is even worse, in our opinion, because then NZXT is advertising a feature which isn't even supported. You'd have to download old software from a third party, and then that doesn't even really work or do anything. So at the end of all of this, you should still just be buying the non-I version of the NZXT cases if you buy them at all. The cases, as hardware, physically, really don't have, there are obviously criticisms we have of those. But from a build quality standpoint, they're pretty good build quality. They're very good. They have good cable management features, good ease of installation features. Airflow is hit and miss, but it can brute force its way through it. And the smart device is a marring of all of that finish if you buy the I version. It's simply not worth it. You'd be better off investing that $30 and buying almost literally any other cooling product and using that to reduce your noise levels. Why spend $30 extra on a smart device which barely works and is not officially supported for its seminal feature if you could spend that $30 on the delta between a not good cooler and a good cooler, or an average video card cooler and a good partner model cooler? The difference you get from the $30 spend there is going to be greater in terms of noise reduction capabilities than what you'll get with the smart device, which at the best of times, thanks to CAM, is frustrating to use, regardless of which version of CAM you use. NZXT is working on another update to CAM. We might revisit it if it's worth revisiting, as in worth our time if they actually fix things. But otherwise, the conclusion of this is this thing doesn't do anything actually special. Everything it presently does can be done by other devices often better, and other software often better. So there is nothing special about this device. And you might as well plug it into the motherboard or get a different fan controller if you really want one and use someone else's software, because it'll probably work a bit better. And the microphone isn't even presently leveraged anyway and isn't leveraged properly when they do try to use it. So that's it for this one. Thanks for watching. I guess this will go back in the trash. Oh man, I got it. We'll see you all next time. Subscribe for more. Go to store.gamersnexus.net to pick up a shirt like this one or the mod mats, and we'll have updates for additional CAM stuff as they publish the changes to the software.